The poor rancher waited for his mail-order bride, but three giant Apache sisters stepped off the wagon. Weston Boyd had been counting the days, his hands raw from work, but his heart full of a desperate kind of hope. He clutched that worn letter, the paper thin and soft from being read 100 times. It promised him a woman named Margaret, a petite schoolteacher from Ohio, who would cook his meals, mend his clothes, and fill the crushing silence of his failing ranch. Instead, three towering figures emerged from the dust cloud, kicked up by the departing wagon. Each woman stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broader than most men Weston knew. Their muscled arms and weathered hands told stories of hard labor, of a life he couldn't begin to imagine. And their dark, unreadable eyes held secrets that made his stomach twist into a cold knot of fear. The wagon driver, a man paid to ask no questions, tipped his hat nervously and whipped his horses into a gallop. He rode away without a single word of explanation, leaving Weston utterly alone with these imposing women who spoke in hushed tones he couldn't understand. The eldest stepped forward, her long, braided hair catching the afternoon light. Her hand rested on the hilt of a knife at her belt. She said something that sounded like a question, but it felt like a command. Weston's mouth went dry. He was a small man on a failing piece of land. His meager savings and his desperate loneliness had somehow sent a signal out into the world. And these women were the ones who had answered. What he didn't know was that these women hadn't come looking for him at all. And the real reason for their arrival would change everything he thought he knew about his quiet, desperate life. Weston Boyd stood frozen in his patched work shirt, feeling smaller than he ever had in his 32 years. The three Apache women towered over him like ancient trees, their powerful frames casting long shadows across his dusty yard. His hands trembled as he clutched the letter, the promise of Margaret, the schoolteacher from Ohio, now feeling like a cruel joke. The eldest woman stepped closer, and Weston could see the intricate scars on her forearms, marks that spoke of battles he couldn't imagine. Her voice was deep and measured when she finally spoke in clear, accented English. "You are the one who sent for us." Her words were clear enough to make his heart race. I think there's been some mistake," Weston stammered, backing toward his cabin door. "I was expecting someone else. A woman named Margaret." The three sisters exchanged a single, sharp glance. The youngest one, who still stood nearly a head taller than Weston, let out a short, humorless laugh. Her muscled shoulders shook as she shook her head, her expression grim. "Margaret is dead," she said simply. "We took her place." Weston's legs nearly gave out beneath him. The letter crumpled in his sweating palm as he tried to process what he'd just heard. These women had somehow intercepted his correspondence, knew about his private arrangement, and had traveled all this way under false pretenses. His mind raced with a dozen terrible possibilities. Were they criminals? Fugitives? The middle sister, whose braided hair was decorated with small metal ornaments that caught the dying sunlight, studied his ramshackle cabin with calculating eyes. She pointed a strong, calloused finger at the sagging roof and broken fence posts. "This place is dying," she observed, her voice flat. "Like you." "I'm not dying," Weston protested weakly, though he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. His crops had failed 2 seasons running. His cattle had wandered off or been stolen by rustlers he was too afraid to confront. He hadn't seen another human being in 3 long weeks. The eldest woman walked past him toward the cabin, her heavy boots leaving deep prints in the hard-packed earth. She tested the strength of his porch railing with one massive hand, and gave a slight, approving nod when it didn't break. "We need shelter," she said, not looking at him. "You need workers. Perhaps we can help each other." Weston wanted to ask 1,000 questions. He wanted to demand they explain how they knew Margaret, why they had come, and what they really wanted from him. Instead, he watched in stunned silence as the youngest sister began unloading heavy, canvas-wrapped bundles from the spot where the wagon had left them, her movements efficient and purposeful. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting the yard in an eerie amber light, Weston noticed something that made his blood run cold. The wooden sides of the wagon they'd arrived in bore fresh scrapes and gouges, and dark stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood marked the wooden planks where they'd been sitting. The bloodstains made Weston's mouth go dry as desert sand. He tried to convince himself it could be anything, animal blood from a hunt, maybe a wounded horse, but the way the three sisters moved with such urgent, coiled precision told him otherwise. These women were running from something, and whatever it was had been violent. "Whose blood is that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The eldest sister, who had been examining his cabin's crumbling foundation, turned slowly to face him. Her dark eyes held no warmth, no explanation, only the cold, hard assessment of someone deciding whether he was a friend or a threat. "Not yours," she said finally. "Yet." Weston felt a shard of ice crawl up his spine despite the afternoon heat. The youngest sister had finished unloading their bundles and was now studying his broken water pump with the focused attention of an engineer. She grabbed the rusted handle with both hands and gave it a test pull. The metal groaned in protest, but under her powerful grip, a stream of clear, life-giving water began to flow for the first time in months. "How did you do that?" Weston asked, moving closer despite his fear. "I've been trying to fix that pump for weeks." The middle sister answered without looking up from an animal track she was examining near his corral. "Men try to force things that need understanding," she said. "You have wolf tracks here. Fresh ones. They've been watching your place." Weston had never noticed any wolf sign. But then again, he'd been so focused on his own slow failure that he'd stopped paying much attention to the world around him. The woman crouched down and pressed her palm into one of the prints, measuring its size with her fingers. "Large pack," she continued, her voice calm. "Hungry enough to come close to buildings. They smell your weakness." The casual way she spoke about predators circling his property made Weston realize how truly isolated and vulnerable he'd become. These three women, despite their mysterious and possibly dangerous past, seemed more capable of surviving out here than he had ever been. The eldest sister walked back toward him, her heavy footsteps deliberate and measured. "We will stay 3 days," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Fix what needs fixing. Then we continue traveling." "Where are you going?" Weston asked, though a part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The youngest sister looked up from the now working water pump, her hands wet and glistening in the sunlight. For a moment, something that looked almost like sadness flickered across her face. "West," she said simply, "as far from here as the land allows." As if summoned by her words, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed across the plains. All three women tensed immediately. Their hands moved instinctively to weapons Weston hadn't even noticed they were carrying. Knives tucked in their belts, a small hatchet on a leather thong. The eldest sister's voice cut through the air like a blade. "How many men know you were expecting a bride today?" Weston's throat constricted as he tried to remember who he'd told about Margaret's expected arrival. Just the mail clerk in town," he stammered. "And maybe I mentioned it to Jeremiah at the trading post." The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. He could now count at least 4 distinct horses, approaching at a steady, determined pace. The eldest sister moved with a startling speed for someone so large, positioning herself behind the corner of his cabin where she could see the approaching riders without being easily spotted. Her 2 sisters flanked the other side of the building, their movements coordinated, silent, like they'd done this 100 times before. "Get inside," the middle sister hissed at Weston, her voice low and urgent. "Stay away from the windows." "This is my land," Weston protested, but the look she gave him could have frozen fire. He backed toward his cabin door, his hands shaking as he watched these 3 mysterious travelers transform into what looked like a team of experienced fighters preparing for battle. 4 men crested the small hill that bordered Weston's property, riding hard and kicking up clouds of dust. Even from a distance, Weston could see they weren't the type of visitors who came calling for social reasons. Their horses were lathered with sweat, suggesting they'd been riding fast for some time, and the way they spread out as they approached his yard suggested they knew how to surround a target. The youngest sister had somehow climbed onto his roof without making a sound, crouching behind the crumbling chimney with a clear view of the approaching riders. Her powerful frame was coiled like a spring, ready to move in any direction. The sight of her up there, perfectly balanced and utterly silent, made Weston realize these women possessed skills he couldn't even begin to understand. The riders slowed as they entered his yard, their leader dismounting with the lazy confidence of someone used to taking whatever he wanted. Weston recognized him immediately. Frank Rollins, a man who claimed to own half the territory and acted like he owned the other half too. Rollins had been pressuring Weston to sell his land for months, making increasingly aggressive offers that felt more like threats. "Boyd!" Rollins called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a predator. "Heard you had some visitors arrive today. Thought I'd come by and welcome them properly." The eldest sister stepped out from behind the cabin. Weston watched Rollins's expression change from smug confidence to something approaching pure shock. She stood nearly as tall as Rollins's horse, her muscled frame making his three companions look suddenly smaller than they had moments before. "You are not welcome here," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with absolute authority. Rollins recovered quickly, his hand drifting toward the gun on his hip. "Well now, that's not very friendly, especially since I have business with Mr. Boyd about this property." But as he spoke, the middle sister emerged from the other side of the cabin, and the youngest dropped silently from the roof to land behind the mounted men. In the blink of an eye, Rollins and his companions found themselves surrounded by three armed women who looked like they could break horses with their bare hands. Frank Rollins tried to maintain his swagger, but Weston could see sweat beading on the man's forehead as he realized his tactical advantage had just evaporated. The three Apache sisters had positioned themselves with military precision, cutting off every escape route while staying close enough to strike if needed. "Now, ladies," Rollins said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "there's no need for hostility. I'm just here to discuss a business matter with Boyd." The eldest sister took a slow step closer to Rollins's horse, her hand resting casually on the long knife at her belt. "Your business can wait," she said. "We were here first." One of Rollins's men, a nervous-looking fellow with tobacco-stained teeth, whispered something urgent to his boss. Weston caught the words, "Apache, dangerous," before Rollins silenced him with a sharp look. "I heard there was supposed to be a school teacher coming today," Rollins continued, his voice taking on a harder, more demanding edge. "Someone named Margaret. Where is she?" The youngest sister, who had moved close enough to touch the flanks of the mounted men's horses, spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a chilling finality. "Margaret decided not to come," she said. "We came instead." Weston noticed that none of the sisters had denied knowing Margaret. The way they spoke about her suggested something far more complex than a simple mix-up at the coach station. These women had deliberately taken Margaret's place. But why? Rollins's horse shifted nervously under him, sensing the tension in the air. "Well, that's unfortunate," he said. "You see, Boyd here owes some people money, important people, and we had an understanding that his new wife would help him get caught up on his debts." Weston's stomach dropped. He'd never borrowed money from Rollins directly, but he'd been forced to take advances on his expected harvest from men who worked for Rollins. The drought had killed his crops, making repayment impossible. Now he understood why the man had been so interested in his mail-order bride arrangement. He saw Margaret as another asset to be seized. The middle sister spoke without taking her eyes off the mounted men. "How much does he owe?" "More than he can pay," Rollins replied with a sneer. "But that's between me and Boyd. Unless you ladies are planning to make this your problem, too." The three sisters exchanged a look. It was a silent conversation that contained an entire world of meaning Weston couldn't begin to decipher. The eldest nodded, an almost imperceptible movement, and suddenly, the dynamic in the yard shifted again. These women weren't just passing through. They weren't just hiding from something. They were making a decision that would change everything. "We are making it our problem," the eldest sister said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Rollins' face darkened, and his hand moved closer to his weapon. "That would be a mistake, lady. A big one." But before anyone could draw a gun, the sound of additional horses approaching echoed from the distance. These riders were moving fast, and their war cries carried clearly across the plains. Rollins went pale as he recognized the sound. The war cries grew louder, a sound that had been haunting Weston's nightmares for months. Apache warriors, maybe a dozen of them, riding hard across the plains straight toward his property. Rollins and his men exchanged panicked looks, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. "This is your doing," Rollins accused, pointing a trembling finger at the three sisters. "You brought them here!" The eldest sister's laugh was as cold as winter stone. "They are not here for us," she said, her eyes locked on Rollins. "They are here for you." Before Weston could ask what she meant, the youngest sister spoke in rapid Apache to her companions. Their conversation was brief but intense, and when it ended, all three women moved with sudden, deadly purpose. The middle sister grabbed Weston's arm with a grip that could have crushed bone and pulled him toward his cabin. "Inside," she commanded. "Stay down. Do not come out no matter what you hear." "Wait!" Weston protested. "What's happening? Who are those riders?" The eldest sister turned back to face him, and for the first time since her arrival, he saw something that looked like profound sadness in her dark eyes. "They are our brothers," she said, "and they have come to bring us home, to die." Weston felt the blood drain from his face. These women weren't just travelers. They were fugitives from their own people, sentenced to death. And their presence on his land had just made him part of a conflict he couldn't possibly survive. Rollins was shouting orders to his men, trying to organize them into some kind of defensive position, but his cowboys were already backing toward their horses. They'd signed on to intimidate a desperate rancher, not fight a dozen Apache warriors on open ground. "You brought this on all of us," Rollins snarled at the sisters. "When those warriors get done with you, they'll burn everything for miles around." The youngest sister had climbed back onto Weston's roof, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to high places. From her vantage point, she called down in English, her voice tight with urgency. 12 riders all armed. They will be here in less than 5 minutes." The middle sister pushed Weston toward his cabin door with enough force to make him stumble. "The woman you call Margaret," she said, her voice low and urgent. "She was our cousin. She tried to help us escape. They killed her for it." Weston's mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place. Margaret hadn't simply died, she'd been murdered. Murdered for helping these three women flee something so terrible that their own people wanted them dead. And now, those same people were coming to finish what they'd started. The approaching war cries split the air again, closer now, and Weston could see the dust clouds on the horizon. Rollins was mounting his horse, clearly planning to abandon the fight before it even began. "This isn't over, Boyd!" he shouted. "When this is finished, I'll be back for what you owe me!" But as Rollins wheeled his horse toward the hills, the eldest sister stepped directly into his path. Her massive frame blocked his escape route completely, and when she spoke, her voice carried the promise of violence. "You will stay," she said, "and you will face what you helped create." Rollins pulled hard on his reins, but his horse refused to push past the towering Apache woman blocking his path. Her muscled arms were crossed over her chest, and she stood as immovable as a mountain cliff. "What do you mean, what I helped create?" he demanded, though his voice cracked with fear. The middle sister answered while checking the ammunition in a rifle Weston hadn't even seen her holding until this moment. "You paid our father to make us marry your business partners," she said, her words hitting the air like physical blows. "Old men who wanted young wives they could control. When we refused, you told him we were worthless daughters who deserved punishment." Weston's stomach turned as he finally understood the full, ugly scope of what had been happening. Rollins hadn't just been pressuring him about debts. The man had been trafficking in human lives, arranging forced marriages, and using tribal politics to get what he wanted. "That's business," Rollins said, though his bluster was completely gone now. "Your father agreed to the terms." The youngest sister called down from the roof, her voice tight with urgency. 2 minutes! They have rifles and war paint. This is not a negotiation." The eldest sister reached up and grabbed Rollins by his shirt, pulling him down from his horse with shocking ease. His feet dangled inches off the ground as she held him at eye level, her massive hands keeping him trapped like a child. "Margaret tried to warn the Indian agency about what you were doing," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "So you had her killed and told everyone she died of fever, but we knew the truth." Weston watched in horror as Rollins's face went white. The man had orchestrated Margaret's murder to cover up his human trafficking operation. And now, the consequences of that decision were thundering across the plains, straight toward them. "I can pay you!" Rollins wheezed, his face turning purple. "Whatever you want! I have money, land, connections!" The eldest sister dropped him into the dirt like a sack of grain. "You have nothing we want," she said, "except your fear." The sound of hoofbeats was close enough now that Weston could feel the ground vibrating beneath his feet. The middle sister pushed him toward his cabin door one final time, her powerful hands surprisingly gentle despite their urgency. "Stay inside," she repeated. "No matter what happens, do not come out until we call for you." "What about them?" Weston asked, pointing at Rollins and his men, who were now huddled together like sheep in a thunderstorm. The youngest sister dropped from the roof, landing silently beside her companions. Her braided hair was streaked with dust, and her dark eyes held the focused intensity of a predator preparing to fight. "They made their choices," she said. "Now they face the consequences." As the three sisters took their positions around the cabin, Weston noticed something that made his blood run cold. The approaching war cries had suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound he had ever heard, because it meant the Apache warriors had arrived, and they were deciding exactly how to handle what they found. The silence stretched like a bowstring, ready to snap. Weston pressed himself against his cabin wall, peering through a small crack between the wooden boards. 12 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses at the edge of his property, their faces painted for war, their rifles held ready. They were a vision of death, stark against the afternoon sun. The leader, a man whose scarred face spoke of countless battles, raised his hand in a gesture Weston didn't understand. The eldest sister stepped forward, her massive frame dwarfing even Rollins's cowboys, who now cowered behind their horses. She spoke in Apache, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Whatever she said caused murmurs among the mounted warriors, and several of them shifted restlessly in their saddles. The scarred leader responded in the same language, his tone sharp with authority. Weston didn't understand the words, but he caught one that needed no translation. Death. It was repeated several times. The way the three sisters tensed told him the conversation wasn't going in their favor. Rollins, still sprawled in the dirt where the eldest sister had dropped him, tried to crawl toward his horse. The youngest sister noticed his movement and placed one massive boot on his back, pinning him to the ground like an insect. Her strength was so casual, so absolute, that Rollins stopped struggling immediately. "Please," Rollins gasped. "I have money. I can pay everyone. There doesn't have to be violence." The middle sister spoke without taking her eyes off the mounted warriors. "You killed our cousin. You sold women like cattle. Violence is all you have ever understood." The Apache leader dismounted, his movements fluid and purposeful. He was smaller than the three sisters, but he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. When he spoke again, his words were directed at the eldest sister, and Weston could hear the raw anger in every syllable. The eldest sister replied with equal heat, gesturing toward the pinned Rollins and his terrified men. Her powerful voice rose and fell like distant thunder. Whatever she was saying seemed to sway some of the warriors, who began to nod in agreement. Suddenly, the youngest sister called out in English, "Weston Boyd, come outside. Our brother wishes to meet the man whose land we claimed as sanctuary." Weston's hands shook as he opened his cabin door. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, but something in the youngest sister's voice suggested this might be his only chance to influence what happened next. He stepped into the yard, feeling smaller than ever, surrounded by so many armed and dangerous people. The Apache leader studied him with dark, piercing eyes that seemed to see everything. When he finally spoke, his English was precise and carefully chosen. These women broke sacred law by refusing marriage to their chosen husbands. The penalty is death." He paused, then pointed a finger at Rollins. "But they also spoke truth about this white man's crimes. The spirits demand justice for both wrongs." The eldest sister took a step closer to her brother, her massive hands held open and empty at her sides. "Let us face our punishment after his crimes are answered," she said, her voice resonating with conviction. "Margaret's blood cries for vengeance first." The Apache leader considered this, his scarred face showing nothing of his thoughts. The fate of everyone in the yard hung in the balance. Finally, he nodded once, a single sharp movement. "The white man's fate will be decided first," he declared. "Then we will settle family matters." Rollins began to scream. The Apache leader's justice was swift and absolute. Rollins and his men were stripped of their weapons, their horses, and their boots. They would walk back to town, a journey of miles over harsh terrain, carrying the message that their brand of human trafficking would bring consequences no amount of money could prevent. Rollins's pleas and threats fell on deaf ears as the warriors escorted them away on foot, their faces burned red with shame and the certainty that their criminal enterprise was finished forever. With the immediate threat resolved, the scarred leader turned his full attention back to his sisters. The three women stood together, their massive frames forming an unbreakable line as they awaited judgment for defying tribal law. "You refused your chosen husbands," the leader said in English, making sure Weston could understand every word. "You brought shame to our family name. You caused the death of our cousin Margaret." The eldest sister stepped forward, her powerful voice unwavering. "We refuse to be sold like horses," she declared. "We chose honor over obedience. Margaret died because she helped us choose freedom over slavery." The Apache leader studied his sisters for a long, silent moment. Then his eyes swept over Weston's property, taking in the broken fence posts, the failing crops, the general air of defeat that had surrounded the place when he first arrived. Then he looked at the now working water pump, the neatly stacked supplies the sisters had unloaded, and the subtle changes their presence had already begun to make. "This land is dying," he observed, his voice echoing the middle sister's earlier words. "Like its owner was dying before you came." For the first time since the confrontation began, Weston found his voice. "They saved my life," he said, surprised by the strength in his own words, not just from Rollins, but from giving up completely. "I was ready to quit, to let everything fall apart. They showed me what real strength looks like." The youngest sister looked at him with something approaching surprise, and Weston realized he'd changed more in the past few hours than in all the months of struggling alone. These women had given him something more valuable than any mail-order bride could have provided. They had given him purpose. The Apache leader made his decision. "You will stay here," he told his sisters, his voice ringing with finality. "This land needs workers who understand survival. This man needs teachers who understand strength. Your exile from the tribe is your punishment, but it is also your freedom." The three sisters exchanged a look, and Weston saw the crushing tension that had defined their every movement finally begin to recede, replaced by a profound sense of relief. They would never return to their birth family, but they had found something different here, something that might grow into its own kind of family. "The debt you mentioned," the eldest sister said to Weston as the Apache warriors prepared to leave. "We will help you pay it, with honest work. This land has good bones. It just needs people who know how to heal broken things." 6 months later, Weston's ranch was thriving. The three Apache sisters had taught him irrigation techniques that made his crops flourish even in the driest seasons. Their knowledge of the land, combined with his own newfound willingness to learn and fight for his home, had transformed the failing homestead into one of the most productive properties in the entire territory. Weston had found the partnership he had been so desperately seeking, just not in the form he'd ever expected. And sometimes, when he watched the three towering women working alongside him in the fields, their powerful frames moving with practiced efficiency, he knew that Margaret's death had not been in vain. It had led to something she would have approved of: justice, freedom, and the kind of family that chose each other, bound not by law or blood, but by shared survival and mutual respect. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.